That was Bobby Darin with his #1 hit, Beyond the Sea. Thank you for tuning back in to 101.7 CARE Radio. Now, for a brief historical recap on the major events of World War II so far.
And now here's Garrett with the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
On January 18, 1943, an insurgency was launched by the Jewish community in the Warsaw Ghetto. The most significant portion of the rebellion took place from April 19th until May 16, 1943. The fighting ended when the insufficiently armed and supplied resistance was thwarted by the German troops. The troops were under direct command of Jürgen Stroop. This has become known as the largest single revolt in the Jewish extermination plan so far. In 1940, the Nazis placed 3 million Polish Jews into a number of extremely crowded ghettos located in large Polish cities. The largest of these was the Warsaw Ghetto, which contained 300,000 to 400,000 Jews. Thousands of these Jews passed away due to disease and starvation. Starting on July 23, 1942, the Nazis planned to transport the Jewish inhabitants to extermination camps. Around the time the deportations began, the Jewish resistance members decided not to fight, believing that they were being sent to labor camps and not their deaths. However, by the end of 1942, it became apparent to the Jews that they were being sent to extermination camps. Then they decided to revolt. Ghetto fighters were armed primarily with pistols, revolvers, and makeshift explosive devices. Polish resistance units smuggled supplies and instructions into the ghetto. Ultimately, the efforts of the resistance proved to be insufficient. The Germans eventually sent an average daily force of 2,090 well-armed troops. However, the Germans still undertook casualties, and the deportation was halted for a few days. Hundreds of Warsaw Jews were willing to fight, including men, women, and children of most ages. On April 19, 1943, on the eve of Passover, the Germans entered the ghetto planning to complete their action within 3 days. However, the ready Jews continued to meet the Germans with Molotov cocktails and hand grenades. When Stroop's ultimatum to surrender was refused, Germans began systematically burning houses block by block to smoke out the Jews. The suppression of the rising officially ended on May 16, 1943. Sporadic resistance continued, but it was eventually wiped out completely by the Nazi force. According to our recent reports, 13,000 Jews were killed in the uprising, and the Germans suffered 110 casualties.
Great piece, Garrett. Now here's Robbie and Garrett with the 1944 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the Jewish resistance that arose within the Warsaw Ghetto in German-occupied Poland during World War II, and which opposed Nazi Germany's effort to transport the remaining ghetto population to Treblinka extermination camp.
What the Nazis are doing to the Jewish ethnicity is disgusting and must be stopped. Thank God the Jewish prisoners are tried retaliating. This has been one of the only cases of them sticking up for themselves throughout this entire atrocity.
It was a bold decision by the prisoners, but the conditions in the ghetto were horrid. Many people have caught diseases from rampant spread of lice in tight living quarters.
They didn't even stand a chance, and with barely any supplies or weapons, they couldn't possibly escape the Nazi forces. But it does show that the Jews are trying to make an effort towards freedom from this catastrophe.
The death toll of the Jewish prisoners of this courageous act was close to 13,000.
At least they died with pride and dignity, trying to fight the abuse and oppression of the Nazis.
Exactly. The remaining approximately 50,000 Jewish prisoners were sent to death camps or concentration camps anyways, so why not try to fight for your people's freedom from the abuse of Germans?
Well, it's a good thing the ghetto has been destroyed now. Operation Tempest has now been in effect for 2 years now, led by the Polish Home Army, the dominant force in the Polish resistance towards Nazi oppression in Poland.
Right. The Polish army led the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, was a heroic and tragic 63-day struggle to liberate World War II Warsaw from Nazi German occupation.
At the time of the uprising in 1944, Allied troops were breaking through the Normandy defenses and the Red Army was standing at the line of the Vistula River. Warsaw could have been one of the first European capitals liberated from the Nazis.
The situation came to an end on July 13, 1944, as the Soviet offensive crossed the old Polish border. At this point, the Poles had to make a decision: either initiate the uprising in the current difficult political situation and risk problems with the Soviet support, or fail to rebel and face Soviet propaganda describing the Home Army as important or worse, Nazi collaborators. They feared that if Poland was liberated by the Red Army, then the Allies would ignore the London-based Polish government in the aftermath of the war.
The urgency for a final decision on strategy increased as it became clear that after successful Polish-Soviet cooperation in the liberation of Polish territory, the plan was intended both as a political manifestation of Polish sovereignty and as a direct operation against the German occupiers.
For a while, about up until the beginning of August, most of Warsaw was in Polish hands. Although various military and political miscalculations, as well as global politics, played among Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, turned the dice against it.
How so?
Simple. There wasn't enough aid from Stalin, Churchill, and FDR.
I see, but the first week of September, both German and Polish commanders realized that the Soviet army was unlikely to break the stalemate. The Germans reasoned that a prolonged insurgency would damage their ability to hold Warsaw at the front line. The Poles were concerned that continued resistance would result in further massive casualties.
Cool story, bro. And now here's Jack with aerial bombings.
The sustained and steady strategic bombing of Britain by Nazi Germany during World War II is also known as the Blitz. This attack on Britain took place from September 7, 1940 up until about May 10, 1941. During this time, the Nazi forces raided and bombed the city of London and then moved on to other towns and cities throughout the country that were also demolished. Outside of London, other important port cities were targeted, including Liverpool, who suffered approximately 4,000 casualties, Bristol, and Plymouth, along with port cities. Industrial cities such as Birmingham, Belfast, Coventry, Glasgow, and Manchester were also heavily attacked. Germans focused on attacking Birmingham and Coventry mainly because of the tank factories and Spitfire plane factories located in Birmingham and the munitions factories located in Coventry. As a result of these attacks and other incidents, the U.S. and Britain teamed up to begin to destroy important German cities. The United States and Britain teamed up against Nazi Germany in July of 1943 in response mainly to the Germans' utter destruction on London in the Blitz in 1940 through 1941. This attack on Hamburg, one of the most important and well-known cities in Germany, because of its large ports and industrial centers, killed approximately 42,600 civilians while wounding 37,000, while the city itself was virtually destroyed. The Allies used area bombing to destroy more space quicker, and it was a relatively new technique used in the bombing of Hamburg, as well as Pathfinders, which sent flares down to targets for the main bomber to shoot at. Even after this devastating ambush, the U.S. and Allied Britain were not done with the severe bombings in Germany, and they made sure the Germans would regret their path of destruction throughout Europe in the bombing of London. The bombing of Dresden, Germany by the United States and Britain took place from February 13, 1945 until the 15th of February. A total of about 3,900 tons of high explosive and extremely dangerous bombs were used in this attack that included a total of 4 separate raids that the U.S. and Britain carried out in the city of Dresden, Germany during World War II. The death toll of this aerial assault in Germany has been reported up to 500,000 people who were killed. However, the Nazi regime in March of 1945, only about a month after the attack on Dresden, ordered its press to publish the death toll of about 200,000, roughly 2/5 of the actual death toll.
Thanks, Jack. Now how about a word from our sponsor?
Hey kids, looking for something fun to do on a hot summer's day? Go down to the local store and buy some Marbles where the fun never ends. The collection includes a multitude of 100 assorted colored marbles for you and your friends to play with. Warning, this toy is a marble, not suited for children under 3 years of age. Thank you, and back to the show.
Welcome back, folks. Now here's Robbie with the fall of Berlin.
The war approached April of 1945, and end was soon to come as the German forces were weakening and losing territory rapidly to the Allies and so on. However, the British and Winston Churchill were worried that the Soviets would defeat Germany and become powerful themselves. The United States, England, and the Soviet Union all wanted the same result, the end of Nazi Germany. But there were internal complications that caused some distrust among the countries. The leaders had not yet decided who would defeat the German capital. Winston Churchill sent a message to Franklin D. Roosevelt regarding the Russians defeating the Germans and saying that if the Russians also take Berlin, will not their impression that they have been the overwhelming contributor to our common victory be unduly imprinted in their minds, and may this not lead them into a mood which will raise grave and formidable difficulties in the future? He wanted the Allies to begin to take control of the city because, while wanting Germany to be defeated, he wanted to weaken the new rival of the Soviet Union as much as possible in the process. Stalin said that the Berlin operation should begin in mid-April as Dwight D. Eisenhower had taken over for FDR, who had passed away, and commanded that the U.S. troops hold their positions and let the Russians do the fighting. Stalin wanted no delay on the destruction of the German army, as Churchill had announced his plans of attacking the Soviet Union in late July, a month before the World War had even ended, known as Operation Unthinkable. However, the plans made by Stalin were quickly carried out, and the operation to invade Berlin was in progress as German soldiers were retreating their capital city. During April of 1945, Stalin and his army prepared to fight the final battle against Hitler and the Germans by crossing the Oder River. The depleted German forces were facing war on multiple fronts as the Soviets and Americans were quickly defeating German military units. Hitler and Germany kept repelling all counterattacks made by the Soviets, but eventually were defeated, and on April 24, 1945, the Soviet army had surrounded the city of Berlin and were prepared to fight. Forces launched an attack on the German capital's Reichstag. It was guarded by Hitler's personal unit of the SS, as well as the soldiers from France, Latvia, and Scandinavia. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler gave his command to another leader and committed suicide after poisoning his wife and dog in order to not be captured by the Allied troops or the Soviets. Later that day, Soviet troops captured the Reichstag and hoisted their country's red flag atop the building. And on May 2nd, Helmut Weidling ordered a ceasefire of the Soviet Union to prevent further casualties in the city. The end of Germany was official as leaders from all countries involved in the war signed a treaty of Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. The Berlin operation lasted 16 days. The Soviet Union lost about 27 million people in the war, including soldiers and citizens, while the British and American casualties only amounted to 900,000 combined. Some say the Allies should have fought in Europe as well as Africa to help end the reign of Hitler's Third Reich. Some 10,000 tanks, thousands of artillery, and 11,000 aircraft were involved in the fight. There was no other operation of that scale in World War II, and it was won by the Russians. The red flag was risen atop the Reichstag in May of 1945, and it became the symbol of victory over fascism.
Thank you, Robbie. And now a word from our sponsor, Coca-Cola. Drink Coca-Cola. It's your passport to paradise.
Now back to the broadcast. Here's Will with Japanese atrocities.
Starting during Japan's Second War with China and continuing on until the end of World War II, the Japanese committed several war crimes. Some describe these atrocities as the Asian Holocaust. These crimes were committed under the rule of Emperor Hirohito. Hirohito, the Imperial Japanese Army, and the Imperial Japanese Navy are the groups that have been held accountable for these terrible events that happened in China, Manchuria, the Philippines, and the rest of the Japanese-occupied Pacific. The Nuremberg Charter describes war crimes as violations of the laws or customs of wars against civilians and the enemy combatants. Several military members of Japan were convicted of war crimes during this time period. Between 1933 and 1945 was when the bulk of the war crimes committed by the Japanese occurred. The crimes that preceded World War II are believed to have gotten Japan involved in the war. Much like the Germans, the Japanese targeted certain groups of people and also forced labor upon the people they had enslaved. They killed about 23 million ethnic Chinese and another 7 million people from the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Manchuria, Burma, and Cambodia. For prisoners of war, the death rate in Japanese camps was 30%, which was 26% higher than the death rate of the Allied forces' prisoners of war camps. The Japanese Navy was under orders to execute all prisoners taken at sea. Some of the most brutal killings were done during the Manila Massacre, the Suk-Ching Massacre, the Rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, and the Kalakong Massacre. From 1942 to 1945, the motto "Kill all, burn all, and loot all" was in effect in China. This led to the death of about 3 million innocent civilians. Victims of the Japanese terror were subjected to vivisections and amputations without anesthesia and were the test subjects of different biological projects for biological warfare. Prisoners of war were often tortured for military intelligence and then usually executed after. It is also believed that the Japanese carried out the act of cannibalism on several of their victims. For forced labor, the Japanese put Asian civilians and prisoners of war in labor camps like the ones run by the Nazis. Most of the people here will work to death and often starve. They also forced young women in Korea into brothels but called them comfort women in a way to relieve the stress of the soldiers during wartime. Emperor Hirohito and high-ranking officials were tried and almost all were convicted. The punishment involved either death or long prison terms.
Wow, folks, that was some great insight. Well, thanks again for tuning in to 101.7 CARE Radio. Stay tuned for next week when we have a segment called See How Much We Care. In this segment, we will be answering questions sent in from listeners everywhere. Thank you and have a great evening.